Good evening to everyone. I hope I'm clear and I'm audible. The famous question of the pandemic, right? Okay. Before we begin the second webinar series from CENTA, which is happening in collaboration with BSSCA, can we quickly have a silent prayer? May I request all the participants to join me for a silent prayer? Thank you. And lovely to have you on a Tuesday evening back again after a Herculean task at school because I do understand a lot of activities and all of us are tensed and working for practical exams, but still you're all making for this. That means I'm sure CENTA is doing a very good job. And I must say, CENTA is associated with CBSE and it did do a quality training recently, and I was a part of it. It was a wonderful session. In fact, I am slowly collaborating the same as a resource person back in my trainings. Thank you, Center, for that. And I have beautiful two women with who is going to take you forward. Our resource people. I welcome Upasna as well as Shruti from Center for making this possible and training my teachers, BSSCA teachers who are here, who have joined for the webinar. Well, let me take the pleasure of introducing Upasna. Upasna is the lead for assessment and certification team at CENTA. She holds a bachelor's degree in biotechnology from Bangalore University. She has worked in the MNC for 8 years before transitioning to education, which she taught in various places like Bangalore, then Pune, and New York. She has also done the Teach for India Fellowship and was working as a curriculum designer before joining Center. A hearty welcome to you, Upasna.
Thank you,
And
ma'am.
that's okay. And we have Shruti with us. Shruti is the lead for learning products team at Center. She holds a bachelor's degree in information science from Vishweshwaraya University. She has worked as a software developer in a MNC for 2 years before transitioning to education, where she taught primary grades in a low-income school as a part of her Teach for India fellowship. Hearty welcome to you, Shruti. And dear participants, welcome once again. Dear participants, a hearty welcome to you as well. Any learning cannot be stagnant. A learning which is a carry forward and taken for a livelihood is always welcome. So let us now listen from our resource people. And over to you, Shruti, as well as Upasna.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the session. I'll just wait for Shruti to share her screen. So I hope our screens are visible to you. Yes. All right. So, again, a warm welcome to everyone. And we're extremely delighted to host this session again for teachers and school leaders from the Bangalore Sahodaya group. And today's workshop is going to be focused on creating rubrics for subjective assessments. We'll look at different things that we go into subjective assessments, rubrics, etc. Right. So just starting off, just a quick recap. This is something that we talked about as part of extremely proud to be associated with CENTA, and this CENTA as most of you may know, supports the entire teacher's entire career cycle. The full form is Center for Teacher Accreditation, and we work towards enabling teachers in making sure that their roles that they become aspirational within their own profession, and what they do they feel the most supported, right? So with that in mind, we have multiple ways in which we support. So there's certification for teachers, which are all available online. The first one, and a lot of you may be aware of this, is the CENTA Teaching Quotient, which is the online assessment where any of you could actually register and take your test your teaching competencies for subject, for pedagogy, communication. Then the other thing is about CENTA micro credentials, which are more in depth, using practical assessments as well on specific competencies. So we have content development, early childhood, OTT, online teachers training, and teaching rather. So various specific competencies that we focus on during our micro credentials assessments, with practical assessments being in place. And then the final one is literally the finale, which is the CENTA TPO, or the Teaching Professionals Olympiad, which is an international competition. Again, these are this just brings this additional zing to what we are doing, and here we are looking for the best of the best teachers in teaching competencies, right? And why would anyone take up CENTA assessments? It's shareable. The TQ badges that we give, they are shareable. You can share them on your profiles, and the certificates, and a lot of governments and institutions look forward to CENTA assessments to sort of streamline their professional development for teachers, their incentive mechanisms for teachers, right? How is the whole I guess the support system, how is it working, right? So it's not a push method, it's very personalized and self-paced, where we say that the teacher own up their own professional development, right? So extremely high quality resources. We have programs that are accredited by us, and again we are associated with various universities who are able to provide for postgraduate certificate programs, right, like Manipal, etc., right? So this is, again, like we said, very personalized. It's not put multiple people in one classroom and deliver your content, but very, very personalized based on what you specifically need, right? So Deepa ma'am's asking about give some insight on self-paced courses as well. Shruti, do you want to just quickly take that?
Yeah, am I audible now? Great. So I think someone's asked about self-paced courses. So Deepa ma'am, if you go to the website m.centa.org, you should be able to see self-paced. We have several self-paced courses which are live, which are basically a course which is more asynchronous in nature, somewhat like a Coursera or a edX or a great learning kind of course, but very specific for teachers, right? So we do have these courses which are 8 hour 10 hour long, and you can take it in your own pace, and then at the end of it there are assignments, very practical hands-on applications in it, and at the end of it you get a completion record for complete if you end up completing the self-paced course. But in the scope of today's session, I think we will come back to the session, and you should be able to visit any of our websites to get more details of any of the products that we offer. So I'm going back to sharing my screen. Is it visible, my screen? Just give me a minute, I'll have to mute.
Yeah. All right. So thanks, Shruti. So again, so moving on from the self-paced courses, just talking quickly about the impact and the community that we've been able to build. We work with 6 lakh 6 lakh plus teachers in 90,000 plus schools, and some of the data points are there. And of course, we have started, moving outside of India as well, working with teachers in the Middle East, Nigeria, Philippines, just to name a few of these, right? So that sort of in a gist talks about the kind of support or the approach that we take in making teaching an aspirational career, right? So, with respect to the agenda today, what we are looking to cover is going to be covered in three different parts. This first section is going to be subjective assessments and their purpose. The second section is very specifically on understanding a well-defined rubric, and we will make it very, very engaging with a practical exercise, or rather practice exercise. And the section three is, summarizing the takeaways, the resources, and feedback. Right, so let's start with the section one, subjective assessments and their purpose. And here I'd like to quickly have a recap. If you were there in the previous session, you would remember that we talked about assessments that can be in different formats or methods, and a lot of you had spoken about the different kinds of assessments that you conduct in your class or are a part of. So when it comes to formats, MCQs were one format that we looked at in detail in the last webinar, right? And you could also have projects, short answer type, match the following type, essays. And again, this is not an exclusive or an exhaustive list. These are just the various different formats that a lot of us are actually used to seeing or being a part of. Now, assessment formats can range from fully objective to fully subjective. We'd seen this also the last time around. When we talk about objective type of assessments, typical objective type of assessments would have a single answer. The who evaluates doesn't matter. In fact, we also talked about how a machine can also should be able to evaluate these questions, right? And if we have to put like a spectrum on which we put these assessments, the objective assessments come on one side, where you have very specific responses. So you could have multiple choice type questions, could have matched the following, or identification type of questions. And as we slowly move ahead on the spectrum, you have different kinds, where you start putting in fill in the blanks type of question, or questions where you are asking students to complete this sentences, or even verbal tests. Whereas if we move to the further extreme right of the spectrum, we have subjective type of assessments where many right answers are possible, right? And here, what the evaluator's opinions are, it matters, right? And also, it's very important to keep in mind what a human being can actually judge, right? So here, quite difficult for a machine to actually perform this type of an assessment. And here we have seen different kinds. And again, I think last time around, some of you had given examples of what these could be, right? Like short answer, or draw something and represent, or explain something in an elaborate or a summarized manner, right? And again, very clear that a person's opinion matters here. Some of the examples again are essays, demonstrations, and project work, right? So now, if I could invite you guys to sort of just type in the chat box to say, what are the other forms of subjective assessments that you may have, quickly, like in 5-10 seconds, if you could just share other types of subjective assessments that you may have encountered, or you may have gotten your students to do. Quick responses in the chat box itself. Still waiting for people to share. Illustration, yeah, thank you, Swati ma'am. Describing, thank you, Sudeepa ma'am. Formative assessments, well, that's again depends on you could have MCQs or subjective both. Summarizing, great. So great examples again, mismatch, periodic test, comprehensions, great examples, right? So now we'll go into a quick activity. Now we've seen the different types of assessments. Now we want to understand from you is what are the purposes for which you use subjective assessments, right? So we've shared the Mentimeter link. That's the link on flashing on our screen as well. It's there in the chat too. You have to go to www.menti.com, and when you go to that page, you will need to enter a code, which is 374245506. Really encourage everyone to use the Mentimeter, because it's a great tool to use it with our students as well. It's a, you can also see the ticker. It's www.menti.com, and enter the passcode rather, which is 374245506. I hope everyone's able to access the Mentimeter, and we can see some very good responses coming in. We want, the purpose is to see whether they can summarize the topic, check for creativity in writing, to understand how much a child has understood the concept. Great point. To make it more descriptive, gauge students' learning, how much student has understood the chapter, writing skills, creativity is not, again coming up. Application based question to relate to real life situations. I think that's a great great purpose to have mentioned here. In mathematics, to verify, prove, evaluate, simplify, solve. Fantastic example from a different subject. Right. So thank you everyone who's used the Mentimeter as well as the chat to sort of like share the purpose for which you would use subjective assessment. I've seen some responses on the chat as well to see whether students are able to make choose the right answer or have like an analogy, right? So great. So performance, quality of understanding, to evaluate students' learning, check for understanding, test the fundamental development of students, and to ascertain that they are able to apply the learning concept. So great way of summarizing everything. Right. So again, these are various purposes, but we've also seen, and now that you're also aware that in our board exam pattern, while term one is going to be multiple choice question, which is going to be for 90 minutes, the term two is very specifically on different format, which is, you could club it as a subjective type of assessment, right? And that's 50% of the syllabus that is going to be covered in term two. And here, case-based questions, situation-based questions, open-ended questions where opinion on a particular topic, short and long answer types could be asked, right? So right, and so this is going to be for 2 hours. So that's a clear linkage of CBSE exams as well, with the kind of assessments that we are covering today. So now, just again moving to like very specifically, why do we use subjective assessments? We've seen examples, we've heard from you in terms of what is it that you would use subjective assessments for. Let's look at why do we use subjective assessments. Not all questions will have a single right answer, right? So not every type of question will fit in an MCQ format like the kind that we saw last time, right? So now it can help us, if we move on to the next point, it will help us measure higher order cognitive skills. So a lot of you gave examples of how you want to test whether the student can, what is the depth of understanding of a student, right? Conceptual clarity, right? And whether they are able to implement their logical and analytical skills, explain, give reasons of what, why, how, and where. So those are higher order cognitive skills, and that can be very effectively tested. Those can be very effectively tested through a subjective assessments, right? So um, and then we also look at a student, someone had also shared this in the chat, that it's not just being able to pick an answer, but also how are you able to articulate it, right? Like, so to be able to write and present your answer in a logical manner, right? So very comprehensive understanding of a student's conceptual knowledge or understanding of that particular topic, right? So in a nutshell, these are various reasons why we would use a subjective assessments. Now, it's easy to create these subjective assessments, but the most intense effort that goes in is in the evaluation as well as normalization. And in a nutshell, and of course, we're going to look at how we can bring about the normalization aspect of it. But what normalization would refer to is that, when I am evaluating something and Shruti is evaluating something, both of us may have our independent views of the students or the group of teachers that we are working with. Now, we need to keep all of that bias and all of that personal opinion aside and make sure that the question that we are both evaluating are actually consistent and uniform. There's no there's absolute objectivity in the way we are actually evaluating. So that's what normalization refers to when it comes to subjective assessment. Now, um, how do I bring that about, right? And before we actually go into the details of how do we break this bit down, we would like to ask you, right? What, according to you, is a good way to ensure that subjective assessments are normalized? So, how will you ensure that when you are evaluating versus someone else is evaluating, it's evaluated in a very, very, objective manner, right? So, what are some ways that you can think of that will help you to ensure this? So, looking for quick responses on the chat itself. So while Pitu Pesolkar ma'am saying that it can help understand the grasping of the student, but what we are also looking to see is if you are evaluating versus someone else is evaluating, how do we make sure that if there's no difference in the way you are evaluating versus someone else? So Pavitra ma'am is saying identifying parameters and setting a rating scale. Great response, ma'am. So Deepa ma'am says that differs from subject to subject. Sharing, Rashmi ma'am is saying sharing the answer key with marking scheme. Someone with the handle RP says have rubrics while evaluating in English. Swati ma'am is saying clear language of questions and rubrics, and I think we are heading in the right direction. Roja ma'am is saying a rating scale or key answers should be analyzed. Great. So we've already sort of segued into the part that we want to get into. So let's move on. Um, and just to sort of like bring our focus, or rather get ourselves more focused into the approach towards rubrics, we want to share an example of a subjective assessment. Now, the learning objective here was summarizing the given passage using key details, right? And this is a sample from the NCRT grade 10 textbook. Some of you may be aware of it. Now, what is the subjective assessment aligned to this objective, right? So let's look at this. Now, not expecting you to read the passage, but let's look at the question. So it says write a short summary for the given passage. Now, if you may just look at the question, you will realize that for you to answer this question does not matter what content is there. At the end of the day, what is expected out of you is to be able to pull out important details and write a short summary of what the content is, right? And so the passage may have been, right now is from grade 10 textbook from NCRT, but for all purposes it could be from a story book that from a renowned author, or it could be like a newspaper article. So what is it that we are trying to test, right? And so in order to understand how this can be normalized, how we can build a proper rubric, what we'd expect you to do, and we'd share this requirement with all of you, is that you get your subjective assessment for any objective for a chapter or grade that you are currently teaching, right? So with like take about 30 seconds to quickly get the assessment that you will be utilizing for today's session, right? So if you haven't if you haven't brought that, you could also use the chat box to type in the subjective assessment that you want to use in today's session. So it could be from any chapter, any subject, any grade. So let's use the next 20 seconds. If you have it on a piece of paper or some written down, if you can just put it on the chat box to say whether you have it, just say yes or no. Waiting for some quick responses. So if you have your questions, so the Purnima ma'am says she doesn't have it, but if you can just quickly think of a subjective assessment for your particular question, great. I see some yeses. If you don't have it, take the next 10-20 seconds to just sort of think of a subjective question that you may have used in your grade, the grade that you're teaching and the subject that you're teaching, right? So let's quickly get that together, and or you can use any of the points that teachers are putting on the group as well, on the chat as well. How do you test for expression, format, content, etc., right? So with that, let's head to the next part of the agenda, understanding a well-defined rubric, and Shruti will be taking you through that using this through an exercise. Shruti, over to you.
Yeah. Hello, am I audible? Hoping I am. Great, thank you so much, Upasna. And we are hoping most of you have your assessment handy with you. And of course, it's very important that your assessment is aligned with a learning objective that you would have done previously in your classroom. And we'll come back to what was the point, the larger point we were trying to even make through this. Slide, right? Like, why is a learning objective and the assessment aligned with that most important, and the content, which is actually the passage or the story, etc., is not the most relevant thing, especially in the context of a rubric. So till now we discussed, Upasna explained about and discussed with all of you about subjective assessments in general, where they fit in the entire spectrum of things of assessments, and also looked at different examples across the spectrum of subjective assessments. And we looked in detail of what their purpose is, and many of you shared your purpose as well, which is very, very aligned and is exactly the point of why subjective assessments are as important, if not more, as objective assessments, right? So in this section, we'll dig deeper into how do we normalize subjective assessments. Many of you again shared in the chat box that rubric is a rating scale, or having a parameter list, etc., is a really good way to ensure we normalize how we evaluate our subjective assessments. And that's exactly the answer we were looking for, because in this section we are going to cover in detail about what is a rubric, why do we use it, what is a well-defined rubric, and all of this we'll be trying to do using a short practice exercise, which is why we wanted all of you to, even if you don't have it, you don't have something directly from your classroom, it's something you can quickly think of, which is why we wanted you to come in with a subjective assessment, which is aligned with any learning objective from a chapter you have covered recently. Okay, so let's begin this section with the most basic question, right? What is a rubric and why do we need it? So, does anybody want to quickly on the chat box put what rubric is according to them? Upasna, can you just quickly read out some responses?
Just waiting for some responses.
Still waiting for a few more responses.
So I think Vaishali ma'am saying marking scheme. Sorry. Yeah. So there are some more responses on parameters, perfect heading of the topic, assessment tool with levels of performance. I think that's a good one. I think there's a response to why we need the rubrics is to standardize the rating, checking the understanding requirements of an assessment. Shruti Krupa ma'am has actually elaborated very well. A rubric is a scoring guide used to evaluate performance, a product or a project. So, great scope.
Amazing answers. A rubric is exactly that, right? It is a scoring guide, but it's not restricted to using it only as an assessment tool. That's just one of the many ways we can use it, but that's also the most fundamental or most common way that we use a rubric. It's a scoring guide which we use to assess student work, especially when there's no clear single correct answer, like what Upasna had shared earlier, right? So it's a tool for teachers to use, which we use to assess student performance in a very normalized, objective way. It is also a tool or a scoring guide which can be used as a means to improve learning. And by this, we mean to provide focused feedback to students and an effective way for students to actually reflect about what they're doing, analyze their own work, and improve their own work. So it's not just, of course, the fundamental use is for us as teachers, but it's also an excellent means for students to clearly understand where they're doing well, where they are lacking, and therefore how do I improve, how can they improve, right? Also, it is a very effective communication tool, right? To set expectations beforehand, which makes the grade overall grading more transparent. So it's not necessary a rubric is something that is only used post facto, but it's also something that can be used prior or pre-assessment, right? To set expectations upfront with students about what the task or the assessment expects, and therefore it makes the overall grading also more transparent because students know exactly what to expect, like on these different parameters, right? So, like we discussed, and many of you also shared, a rubric reduces subjectivity that's associated with subjective assessments. And this is how we can ensure we're being fair, we're being unbiased, and we're, like normalizing the overall evaluation process of assessing subjective assessments. So great. Thank you so much for sharing those responses. And as you can see, we are very, very aligned with what we think about a rubric. I'm delighted to see so many of you who already come with that understanding, and I'm sure many of you already use it. So let's quickly go to this section, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with because you did mention about the different levels, the rating scale, criteria, parameters, etc. So that's exactly what this section is. We're just going to look at the anatomy of a rubric, right? What does it look like? Of course, we know it we can clearly see on the screen. It looks like a table with few numbers and few words called criterion, etc. So basically, what the criterion are the different parameters or criteria that describe what the assessment is all about, right? Or what are the most important things that the assessment has asked, which is of course aligned with our learning objective, that is to be evaluated or assessed when you as a teacher is going to be assessing it, or something that you want to upfront communicate to students that this is what I'll be looking for, right? Or something that you tell students that in this criterion, this is how you have performed, and this is where you need to improve. So that's exactly what criteria is. Next, of course, the rating scale. So for the scope of this session, we have used a rating scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, but that's not fixed, right? You can have a 2-point rubric, a 3-point scale rubric, 4.5, 6. So there's different, it's not a fixed number. It's again purely depends on the assessment and the learning objective assessment, your student context, the variance in the performance levels of students, etc. Right? And then comes the indicators, which is basically the indicators, descriptors, whatever you can call them, for each criterion, which is basically each of these white cells that you see here is an indicator, right? Which is basically where what does for criteria one, what does indicator one mean to what does indicator four mean? So that's exactly what indicator means, and it elaborates or it describes more about what different students at different levels will be able to do. Okay, so now that we've looked at the what of a rubric, why of a rubric, and we've also looked at the anatomy of a rubric, let's move on to the actual process of creating a rubric. Let's look at what the steps are in creating a rubric. And this is where I want all of you to also be involved with your subjective assessments. I want you to keep that handy, because now is when we'll slowly start using it. And disclaimer that we'll also be using Mentimeter, so we'll be switching a little bit between Mentimeter and your subjective assessment. So keep both the Mentimeter window handy and your assessment with you handy. So if that's clear, if my instructions are clear, please just tell me a yes or a thumbs up on the chat box. Keep your assessment, whatever sample you have ready with you, the assessment question and the learning objective it aligns with, and keep your Mentimeter window wherever the second window is handy as well. Cool. Waiting for some responses. Okay, I can see many of you have said yes. Great. Awesome. So let's move on then. Okay, so we saw what the three main aspects of a rubric are, right? Was criteria, rating scale, and indicators. So let's come to the first step to create an effective rubric, which is to list the criteria of your subjective assessment. Okay, and how do we do this? So this itself is a two-step process. So when you have your subjective assessment with you, step one is actually to list all the possible criteria that you think is relevant to check in that assessment, right? And by this I mean you may not have any funneling images, whatever comes to your mind you think is relevant for that question, put down everything, right? And then comes the next step, which is to actually prioritize in this list of things what are my non-negotiables. What, according to not just what I think are important, but according to that question and according to alignment with the learning objective, what are non-negotiables? And in this, you basically need to ask three main questions. Firstly, are the learning objectives reflected in the criteria? And this is when we are coming back to the point of very important to have your assessment, number one, aligned with the learning objective. Firstly, have a learning objective, have your assessment rather aligned with that objective. And when we are checking the criteria, we check if the learning objective, whatever the learning objective was, is that getting reflected in the criteria? Next question. Is the assessment question aligned with the criteria? And by this we mean, does the question allow you to exhibit the criterion? For example, if in my question I'm asking about a specific thing or I'm not asking about something, right? But in my Upasana, you'll have to mute. In my question, I have not mentioned something, but in my criteria, I'm asking for something. For example, in my question, I'm not looking at students' presentation skills. They just have to submit like a short summary of something, similar to our example, which we'll come back to. But in the criteria, I have presentation as a very concrete step, or I have verbal communication as a concrete criteria when the question is a written communication question, right? That becomes misaligned. So it's very important to see if your question allows students to exhibit the criterion. And second is, does the criterion capture the main things the student is most likely to answer? So it's also important for you to think, okay, if I give this question, what are the possible things that the student will definitely answer? Right? Like it's very important to know what is the mindset your children will answer these questions with, so that that is captured in your rubric. Otherwise, your rubric is not relevant to your students. And the third thing is there any other general things? So the first two are mainly aligned with the assessment and the learning objective that you had. But also as a teacher, different teachers may have their own different styles of assessing. I as a teacher may want to also test for communication, grammar, spellings in every subjective assessment that I give my students. I may want to test that. But another teacher may not want to test that because her students are already very good at that. They're already experts in their communication. So I don't want to test for that anymore. My rubric is not going to test for that. So that's a call every teacher can take based on their own set of students and based on their own what is a non-negotiable for them, right? Coming back to the question of what are the non-negotiables. So like I said, step one, first list everything when you talk about your criteria. Second is prioritize these criteria to understand what is most important, and you can use these three questions as guiding questions to help you do that. So I'll pause here for 10 seconds for you to just quickly look at this, and then we will actually do a short Mentimeter exercise, and then we'll come back. Great. So now let's bring back the example that Upasana discussed with all of you, right? About the passage. So the learning objective was to summarize the given passage using key details. Like we discussed, passage is not relevant. This is exactly where that point is connected back to rubrics, right? Even to create your rubric, the content is not relevant. What's relevant is the learning objective and the question or the subjective assessment aligned with that learning objective, which are the two most important things to create any rubric. Having the content of the passage not relevant, because this rubric should work for any passage. Similarly, having all the student responses ready and then creating a rubric is also not the most ideal way. We'll come back to when student responses influence a rubric, but to begin with, when you create your subjective assessment, the next step should be to create your rubric and not wait till the entire assessment is complete, right? So that you know upfront what you're looking for. So now for this learning objective and this subjective assessment, which is write a short summary for the given passage, of course you can see that the subjective assessment is aligned with the learning objective. That check is done. Now I want all of you to think about, for this assessment, which is aligned with this learning objective, what are the different criteria you would list? So just four criteria that you think are relevant to be tested or assessed in our rubric for this particular assessment. So once again, I'll ask all of you to go to menti.com. You must already have the screen open. Upasana, I'll just move on to the second question. And all of you should be able to see the question, what are the different criteria you would list for this subjective assessment? And I'm going to go back to the screen to show you what the assessment is. I hope all of you have the code ready and all of you are on the screen. In a minute or two, maybe in another 30 seconds to 1 minute, I'll switch to the Mentimeter screen to see what are some responses you all have shared. But take 10-15 seconds or even more and think about, for this subjective assessment, write a short summary for the given passage. What are some criteria which you think are very important to be assessed? Okay, we'll wait for 10 more seconds and then we'll move to the Mentimeter screen. You can take your time, think about what are the different criteria, and you can list it down. You can list them down one by one. The assessment is write a short summary for the given passage, and it's aligned with the learning objective. Summarize the given passage using key details. Okay, so we'll just quickly switch to the Mentimeter screen to see what are some responses you all have shared. Okay, so I see keywords, grammar, okay, introduction of the topic, conclusion, okay, meaning of keywords, more active characters, okay. See a lot of different criteria that all of you are mentioning. Understanding of story, okay, presentation. So yeah, also when you're typing these down and everybody else is looking at this, think about, go back to those questions, right? Which of these are aligned with the learning objective? Which of these are aligned with what the question is asking? Which of these are what students will likely share with us, right? And what else do you want to test? Like I see that a lot of teachers want to test for grammar, even though in the question itself it's not mentioned write a short summary using correct grammar, because that's a inbuilt thing that a teacher may want to test, correct? And I also see a lot of criteria which I think may not be fully aligned. Can somebody list down in the chat box what are some out of this list you see that you think is not aligned to this subjective assessment based on prioritizing the criteria, right? Of course, all of them are relevant, But if you have to prioritize, because a rubric cannot test 10 different criteria, right? Max, we will have 3 to 5. So if you keep that in mind, can you think of what in this list may not be very relevant? Can someone quickly put down in the chat box? What from this list may not be fully relevant? So I'm just coming to the chat box now to quickly see vocabulary. Someone saying vocabulary. Okay. Uh, so I'm just looking for more responses of what you think may not be relevant. We saw what is relevant here. I want to see now what you think is not relevant from this list. So Purnima ma'am, Nena ma'am are saying vocabulary. Okay. Sudeepa ma'am saying presentations are dancing. Sorry ma'am, it is word cloud. So every time somebody responds, it moves around, and so whatever is most people are responding, that comes as big words, right? So many of you are saying keywords, many of you are saying grammar, many of you are saying comprehension, many of you saying vocabulary. So what do you think? So Swati ma'am says punctuation is not very relevant. Pavitra ma'am says character, knowing about the character as such. Someone said, Sudeepa ma'am said word limit. Excellent, right? Like word limit is not mentioned anywhere in the question. So of course that's not a very relevant one. Though here it's mentioned word limit is a criteria somebody has mentioned. Great. So we discussed what are some relevant criteria, and we also discussed what are not very relevant from the list you shared. Great. Now let's actually do this exercise together, right? So we are going to, through this workshop, actually build the rubric for this learning objective, so for this subjective assessment rather, which is aligned with the learning objective. Through the rest of the workshop, we are going to build that full rubric, right? So let's see. So when I think about the criteria for this assessment, all possible criteria, again, this is not exhaustive. These are just some of the things that we could come up with when we looked at the assessment at first glance, right? Key details, because the learning objective also mentions this main idea. To be able to summarize anything, you need to be able to identify the main idea. Details which support the main idea. A summary is not complete if you're not adding additional points that are supporting the main idea or building off of the main idea. Drawing conclusions. A summary is only complete if you have a conclusion, you're making an inference and concluding in some way, right? Making connections to text. Okay, you're connecting in some way to the text. Creativity, how creative you are. Alignment with the given passage. Organization, overall presentation, writer's tone, like what is, if a child is writing a summary, what is the tone they are using, adhering to word limit. These seem like all the possible criteria that could be relevant to a assessment on writing a summary. But now let's try to filter this, right? Let's try to funnel it. And to do this, I'm going to keep those 3 points handy, right? And what were those 3 points? Basically, are the learning objectives reflected in the criteria? Is the assessment question aligned with the criteria? And also any general aspects I may want to test. To begin with, actually, there are some criteria that I feel are redundant. For example, key details, alignment with the given passage, and organization. I feel these are redundant because key details is anyway covered when I talk about the main idea or the details which support the main idea, right? Similarly, alignment with the given passage, it's understood that when I'm talking about a main idea or details which support it, it's going to be with respect to the given passage, right? And organization also, I am eliminating it upfront because I feel like in this passage, when I'm summarizing, I am going to be talking about a main idea and details that support it. So naturally, the organization is going to happen. So I feel it's redundant. So these are upfront. I'm just removing them as criteria. Now, next, let's look at alignment with the learning objective, right? Making connections to text. Nowhere in the learning objective are we talking about students being able to connect, making self connect, text to self or text to text or text to world connections, right? We are not looking for children to make any connection, share their opinion in this workshop, in this learning objective at least. So that I eliminate. Creativity. I'm not necessarily looking for how creative students are. I basically want them to, sorry, think something has happened. Just give me a minute. Yeah. So I basically want to see how students are able to summarize and not necessarily how creative they are with their summary, right? That's not the point of the learning objective. If the learning objective was ideate for a passage and share your thoughts, etc., then maybe creativity would have made more sense. Again, writer's tone. I am not looking for students to share their opinion as such in this workshop. So, sorry, in this learning objective, right? So it's now again not relevant, at least with this learning objective. Now, next, when I come to alignment with the assessment itself, overall presentation is not something I'm looking for in this, because I've not mentioned in my assessment write a short summary in a neat A4 size paper or in a neat box with a title. I'm not asking for any of these things from the student, right? So if I'm testing for presentation, then I'm not aligning with what my assessment is asking. I'm being unfair because I'm asking for something which is not even part of my assessment. So it's very important that I ask myself the question, does the question, which is the assessment, allow you to exhibit the criteria? In this case, it does not, right? And similarly, word limit. Somebody, Sudeepa ma'am had mentioned that word limit is irrelevant because I have not given any sort of word limit in the assessment. So if I'm testing for that, again, it will be unfair to students because that's not what the assessment is asking, right? And now I'm thinking of what other. So in this way, I've been able to funnel all possible criteria to a sub list of this overall list. And maybe another one, thinking about me as a teacher, I do want to check for children's grammar, spelling, and all these other punctuations, etc. Some of these things, and I'm just going to add that as an additional point, which may not have been a possible, criteria that I thought of upfront, but it's something I do want to test. So now after this process, I have prioritized my criteria and I've come up with these four main criteria, which is the main idea, details which support the main idea, being able to draw conclusions from the whatever the main idea and the details are, and doing a general check of spellings, grammar, etc. Right? So in this way, I have been able to prioritize the criteria for the given subjective assessment. Now, what all of you are going to do is you are going to try this out for your own subjective assessments. So I've put down the table of how to prioritize also on the left. So take 5 minutes. I'm going to start the 5 minute timer, and after 5 minutes, it will ring. So just take 5 minutes, look at your subjective assessment, look at the learning objective it's aligning with, and try to list down and prioritize the criteria. First list down and then prioritize what are your non-negotiables for the particular subjective assessment that you have, that you definitely want to test in students, right? And to do this, your 5 minutes start now. Once you're done, we'll take on the chat box, we'll just quickly discuss, you can share what are some of the, you can share your assessment question and the learning objective it aligns with, and what are some of the criteria that you have come up with. And if you're the sooner you're done, you can just quickly share. So you all have 3 minutes to go, little more than 3 minutes. You all have 2 minutes to go. So I'm just going to quickly switch my screen and see what's happening in the chat box. Kiangwi ma'am, Isaya ma'am, you've asked, is a method of assessment based on the criterion in a learning in it measure based on the criterion in a learning areas. It measures the cognitive and psychomotor ability of the learner. Can you just elaborate, what do you mean by method of assessment? Do you mean the actual, when you're administering it, what do you look for in the child, or do you mean the format or method, like is it an MCQ or is it a formative, summative? What exactly are you trying to explain? Can you just elaborate? Shobana ma'am has mentioned, ma'am, it'll be great if you can also mention what is the subjective assessment and the learning objective. But you have mentioned the criteria you are going to look for is comprehension, central idea, maintained, suitable title, grammar. Okay, so ma'am, I'll actually push you to think about when you mention comprehension, right? Isn't central idea, suitable title, at least those two already covered within comprehension? So comprehension is broad, and within that, like, only if a student is able to comprehend, will they be able to identify the central idea? Will they be able to give a suitable title, right? So do you want to maybe break down comprehension further? Central idea, suitable title look good. What else? And again, from the central idea, title is something that you should be able to get, but that's okay. Maybe from a presentation standpoint, if in your question you mentioned write a summary with a suitable title, then you can test, yeah, your criteria can be title, right? And grammar is fair enough. Vijay Shri ma'am's assessment is card making. Would be great if you can elaborate that further, ma'am. But you have said writing beautiful words, creativity, use of words. So you're saying, so again, writing beautiful words, use of words are redundant. But I think your criteria could be creativity is, of course, one thing that you should be assessing. Use of words, use of vocabulary is another thing that you should be assessing. I see that somebody's question has been pinned to the screen. Yeah. We'll come to your question, sir. And then I see, I'm just looking at the chat box for a few more responses. Dawa Sharing Sir has said that the question is summarize the poem in your own words and in not less than 10 lines. And he's very clearly listed down his criteria: main idea, comprehension, word choice, writer's tone, creativeness, grammar, and conclusion. Okay, so sir, I really like that you mentioned your question. Thank you for that. Summarize poem in your own words. But when you think about the criteria, right? Great, main idea is great. Again, the same point that I mentioned to ma'am earlier. Comprehension is something which is very broad, and main idea comes within that, right? So you will have to, so comprehension itself is redundant if you're also testing for main idea. Then there's word choice, great. Great, because you have mentioned summarize in your own words, so you're checking for what kind of words the students use. Great. Then writer's tone. Okay, and you ask why do you think writer's tone is important? When I don't know what your learning objective is, but from your question, you have not mentioned where writer's tone or opinion comes into play. So you may have to think about writer's tone a little bit. Creativeness, great. Maybe that is something that you're looking for in your learning objective as well. Grammar and conclusion, you cannot combine the two, right? Grammar is very specifically to do with grammatical conventions, and conclusion is again related to comprehension, related to the main idea, right? So that would be a separate uh, criteria, and grammar would be a separate criteria. I can see many more of you sharing. Great, great going. In the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly move on. But I'm very happy to see that many of you have listed down your criteria. I hope these subpoints helped you reach those criteria that you have picked for your subjective assessment. Great. Is my screen visible? Let me just quickly share my screen. Great. Okay, so now let's move on to the next step. Now that you have listed down the criteria and you've figured out how to prioritize, what are the questions to ask, what are your non-negotiables, and identified what your criteria are, the next step is to fix, a bit more simple, but also there's a lot of thought that goes behind this, which we'll discuss. Next step is to fix a rating scale for your subjective assessment. So the criteria is done. Now it looks more like a checklist, right? How to convert this checklist to a rubric. That's where rating scale comes into play. Rating scales typically include both numerical and descriptive labels. So a rating scale ideally should have your 4, 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3, 4, and also what that exemplify. A 4 means excellent. A 3 means good. 2 is needs improvement. 1 is poor, etc. Right? Both, it's important. It's more comprehensive if you have both laid out in your rating scale. Right? Next, a rating scale usually consists of an even number of performance levels. If it's odd number, what usually happens is the middle level, right, that tends to become catch-all category, and by that we mean that almost everybody will fit under that category if it's odd. It's just like how, like one person gets the focus if in a dance there are 3 people dancing or 5 people, right? So it's important if it's even, to ensure that it's more comprehensive, and the difference is not very high. There's not a high variance in the difference of what each level has. So preferable to have an even number of performance level, unless you very specifically need an odd number of levels. And again, a 4-point or 6-point rating scale is typically considered standard. Now again, there is research, there are studies which says that the number of rating, the point or the number of scale, like levels in your rating is irrelevant to the reliability of a rubric. There are also other studies that says that a 4-point is more reliable because it's kind of like within a particular range from 1 to 4 to 1 or 1 to 4, and it gives very comprehensively gives you enough information to make it reliable. And some studies say a 6-point is even more comprehensive because you can test for even more levels in it, right? So like I mentioned, even in the beginning, it's also very dependent on your classroom, your students, and the variance in the learning levels of your own students. But typically a 4 or a 6-point is considered standard. Also, the rating scale, of course, it can be a 1 to 4 or a 4 to 1. It's vice versa. There's no fixed rule on how to actually create how to sequence the scale. It can be ascending to descending or descending to ascending. Okay, so now let's come back to the question that we were dealing with, which was writing a short summary for the given passage. What is the rating scale you would list for this subjective assessment? So again, go back to Mentimeter. So go to www.menti.com. You can see the passcode here, and you can see a screen which is basically asking you to pick between different ranges. So there's 1 to 2 to 1 to 3, 1 to 4, etc. Right? What is the rating scale you would list for this subjective assessment? We'll shortly go to the Menti screen and see what are some, which one has got the highest responses, or most of you have picked which one. So we'll wait for another 10 seconds. So think about this subjective assessment and think about what is the rating scale you would list. Okay, so quickly going to go to the Menti screen and see what most of you have shared. Okay, I see a lot of you, okay, not a lot of you because many of you are still responding, waiting for more responses. But I see that a majority of you here, in the 15 of you, have said 1 to 4. Okay, some of you have said 1 to 3. And those who have said 1 to 3, can you share on the chat box why do you think a 3 pointer? Those who have said 1 to 4, why do you think a 4 point scale is relevant to this question? Similarly for the rest, I see that nobody has picked 1 to 6. Okay, coming back to StreamYard, to the chat box rather, to see what all of you are sharing. Okay, I can see many of you are also sharing in the chat box. Um, so I see 1 to 3, 1 to 5, 1 to 6. Manjeet ma'am, you just have to go to www.menti.com and put down this number, which is basically 37424506. And even if you were not able to respond there, it's okay. You can just respond on the chat box. I can see that most of you are saying 1 to 4. Quickly coming back to the chat box, Amira ma'am says, I'm not sure what you have picked, ma'am, but you're saying all type of students can be assessed. Okay. Many of you saying 1 to 4. Can few of you quickly share on the chat box why 1 to 4? It covers student assessment ranges more precisely. Okay. More the options may confuse. So Ram sir says if we have more, maybe you have given a lower, you have picked a lower range, and you're saying if you have too many levels, it could confuse. Depends, right? So Vikas sir says 1 to 6 is very descriptive and gives a clear picture. Think about in context of, that's a great point, sir, and it's an important point, but it also is very aligned with what you're covering, like what is the assessment itself, right? So that's important, and that's something we need to take into mind. Let's come back to the session. So I think I'm just going to share. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. My screen is visible? No. Okay, great. So I can see that many of you have shared 1 to 4. And Vikas said 1 to 6 because it's more descriptive and scope for even more normalized assessment. I think it's important to keep in mind what the assessment is and then decide, right, whether how descriptive it should be. For this assessment, a 4 point rating scale is actually comprehensive enough and good enough to get objective evaluations. So we have made it as a 4 point scale. So you can see if you listed it from the highest to the lowest, which is 4, 3, 2, 1. And you can also see that the criteria are clearly put down. Main idea, supporting details, conclusion, grammar. And the rating scale we have used is 4, 3, 2, 1. So you can already see that we have already constructed two parts of the rubric at this point, right? Now, what I'll ask all of you to do is take 2 minutes, exactly 2 minutes, and think about now for the criteria that you have come up with, right? You can also maybe in your book, in your notebook, wherever you want, draw a quick table, list down those criteria on the left, and think about what kind of rating scale you want for your assessment. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this, and then we'll quickly come back. Your time starts now. Keep some of these points in mind that I've put on the left when you're looking at your subjective assessment and the criteria to fix the rating scale.
So I think Sudeepa ma'am is bringing up a point about don't use poor, instead state as scope for improvement. I think that's a good point made, ma'am. A lot of our rating scales and rubrics have poor, like even in common usage. That tends to be a little harsh, but I think it also gives a very clear picture of what the requirement or rather area of improvement is. So, yeah.
Also,
Wonderful.
great point, Sudeepa ma'am. And I think it becomes even more relevant when we use the rubric as a means of communication, means of improvement or communication for students to keep in mind that such words could, like lead to a negative impact on them. So that's a very good point to keep in mind. But in terms of as an assessment tool, we will, I mean, having poor is something that gives more clarity to the evaluator, but point taken. It's important to keep in mind what the language you're using for the descriptors, for the rating scale itself is. I think that's a fair point. Okay, all of you have less than 30 seconds. Just quickly going to come back to the chat box as well. Sudeepa ma'am is saying my water bottle and top match. Thank you. Yeah, not a coincidence, ma'am. Sorry, I mean it is a coincidence. I didn't plan it. Anyway, uh, so Dawa sir says maybe we can use descriptive phrases varying the degrees. Of course, I mean that was the whole point of how it was, even in what we listed down. But we need to be cognizant of what kind of and sensitive to what kind of words we want to use. Okay, so I see a lot of you listing down 1 to 4, and Surama ma'am has listed down what her, her criterias, and I'm so happy to see a math example: accuracy, application of concept, clarity of thought, crisp steps. Again, ma'am, think back about what do you mean clarity of thought, and how does that is that connected to crisp steps, or is it not in a mathematical context, right? Because children are not going to be writing sentences. So is the thought going to be captured in how crisp their steps are? Look, think about that. Great. So I can see a lot of you. I see some social studies examples. Great. Good to see more than just English teachers joining us today. Of course, we are working with an English example, but this is relevant to this concept, and these steps are relevant to all subjects everywhere, right? And all grades as well. Okay, let's quickly come back. I see that many of you have mentioned 1 to 4. Your 2 minutes are, I'm sure it was up. Sorry, I lost track of time. Okay, now let's come back to the final step in creating the rubric, which is, of course, the cells, right, that have to be filled, which are nothing but the indicators of quality, the quality indicators or the descriptors, like we call them, for the subjective assessment. Now, there are several steps that we will discuss about in this, but the most important step, right, which is step 1, when we come to indicators, is to begin with the highest level of the scale to define top quality performance. So, this is something that it can either be something that you have prepared beforehand in terms of having an exemplary student response ready with you. So you have that ready with you, and therefore you know what is top quality performance going to look like, or you actually think about this and list it down for yourself, that the best answer, or somebody who scores full marks, what all will be there uh, in their response, right? So coming back to, and of course, remember that this is the level that you want all students to achieve, and therefore it should not be where you think your first ranker is going to answer this way. It's not. That's not how we think. But we think about exemplar. What is an exemplar response that I, as a teacher, expect, even if it means pushing our students to do better, right? But that's the step 1. Look at the highest rating. In our case, it's a 4, right? In our example, and think about for 4 in our example, what will top quality performance look like? So coming back to the same assessment, which is the summary assessment, what do you think you will have under 4 for all the different criteria? So think about, so when you look at this, right, think about for main idea, what would your 4 look like? For supporting details, what would your 4 look like? Conclusion, what would your 4 look like? Grammar, what would your 4 look like? What would someone who gives top quality response, what all would it cover? And again, like we mentioned earlier, this does not need you to already have your responses ready. You can have your exemplar response, which you think is how it should be answered, ready with you, and you can use that, or you can just look at your criteria itself and think about what do I expect students to tell for this specific criteria, what is the top quality answer I expect. So again, the indicators are, go back to Menti, and you will see there are four indicators. For main idea, what do you think is a top quality student? What will they cover in their under main idea, right? Similarly, what will they cover under supporting ideas? What should be covered under grammar? And before that, what should be covered under conclusion, and what should be covered under grammar? So again, go back to www.menti.com, enter this passcode, and I know we keep going back to menti.com, but it's only so that you're able to switch screens, you're able to use another tool. We want to like ensure it is engaging for you also, to try out a different tool rather than just using the chat box. So enter this passcode and you will see a question which is basically, what are the indicators for highest level that define top quality performance? Think in terms of the main idea for our question, right? Think in terms of supporting details. Think in terms of conclusion. If a student is concluding, what is the exemplar response you expect? And think in terms of grammar. So we'll spend another 10-15 seconds. Whatever you, or even if you can think just for one criteria, think about that, list it down, and we'll quickly switch and see what are some of the responses all of you are sharing. And again, that's another reason why we use Mentimeter, because we want to share with you what are some responses you have given, right? In the chat box, you're not able to see very clearly. We don't get a full picture because it keeps scrolling. Okay. Okay, so in the indicators, I'm seeing all of you list down the criteria itself or ratings. I'm asking you to, let me give you an example, right? For main idea, if it is at a 4, what I would expect is the student has correctly identified main idea, has identified what the main idea of that passage is, using several key details from the passage itself. From the passage itself, the student has been able to correctly identify, 100% accurately identify what the main idea is. That is what a student, that is what an exemplar response or a 4 rating for main idea would be. Similarly, for grammar, a 4 rating would be, the passage contains almost 0 to no errors. Okay, I can see few points. Main idea 4 means the child has understood the story very well. But when we use words like understood, is that giving us a clear picture when we are evaluating it? How can we break that down further? Uh, Able to relate the concept with the example. Okay, understanding of the concept. Come back to the English example we have, right? So somebody has mentioned answer should be precise, to the point. It should be crisp. It should be grammatically correct, written in neat, clean handwriting. Okay, students, elaborate answer. Okay, I see a series of different responses. Let's quickly come back. Also, in the interest of time, we have 10 minutes to go. I'm just going to quickly show what an exemplar response, right? What is the top quality performance that I expect from students? This is what I expect. Main idea, being able to correctly identify the main idea using key details from the passage. Supporting details, clearly states at least 2 or more details using their own words, which supports the main idea. It's not random details, but they actually support the main idea. Conclusion writes a clear concluding statement which is aligned with the main idea and the supporting details. And grammar contains few or no spelling and grammatical errors. So these may seem like, okay, this is what I expect. This is what is the basic response, but that's not how it works when we have a like range of different students in our classroom, right? So it's important that a 4 is what you are expecting as an exemplary response, and that's what we've listed down here. Now let's quickly come back to step 1 is done, right? Within indicators, we have been able to define what the highest level is. Next, we have already created the indicator for rating 4. Now what we need to think about is, in comparison to this, what does just one step below, which is rating 3, look like? And what does the other extreme, rating 1, look like? So this is how we need to build off of what we have put for rating 4 and go backwards, right? Just like for 4, you should be able to visualize what the response associated with each rating looks like. So that's like I mentioned, having that exemplary response in place, you should be able to visualize what students may be answering, and then keeping that in mind, fix what the develop the indicators, right? Second, think about, don't try to combine too many criteria as a single criterion. Indicators will become impractical. Like we saw a lot of examples of conclusion being combined with grammar, right? Or grammar being combined with main idea. That does not work. They are two separate things. If you put them in one criteria, or if you put them in one indicator, right, then it's just going to not be comprehensive enough. And one more thing to remember, change and continuity are both important in your progression. So as we move from rating 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, that there should be clear changes in what the student is doing or not doing, but it should also not be sudden. Like in 4 rating, you cannot say correctly, like a student correctly identified main idea, and in your 3 rating, you cannot have student cannot identify main idea. It cannot be sudden, it should not jump suddenly. There should be a range, there should be a progression, right? And if the variance, like if the variance among your students is high, and you usually use a 4-point scale, you may have rubrics with significant jumps sometimes. Like if the range of students in your classes, they're so different from each other, and you're using a 4-point rubric, and it's not that the jumps may look significant, then you may also have to think if you have to use a 6-point rubric, right? If there are so many different levels of students in your class. So therefore, when we say change and continuity are both important, it's important there is change from two indicators cannot look the same because there are different levels, right? But they should be continuous also. They cannot suddenly jump from one another. And also make sure the language that you're using reflects the change in performance and not the importance of a criterion. So the indicators should not mention that, oh, this is more important, this is less important, or it should not be written in such a way that one criteria looks important, the other doesn't look important at all. It should mainly talk about how the performance of the child, or how the performance for that criteria is changing, rating level after rating level, right? And the last point is try to create likely scenarios rather than all possible combinations. So in your rubric, you should not, you should not have everything that the child will be able to do. You should not be listing it down that way. You should on your own be thinking about your students, what are the likely responses they can give, and what are likely responses they may not give, and then make your rubric more crisp. Otherwise, your rubric just ends up having all sorts of permutation combinations, and that again becomes just unusable, right? Some response may always fall outside these scenarios, and at that point, which is why we say for subjective assessments we need human judgment. You need to be able to apply your own judgment in some scenarios. Like a rubric may not, however comprehensive it is, may not cover everything, right? So keeping all of these points in mind for indicators, we saw 4 and we worked on that together. But this is a full picture of the rubric. We don't want to go into the details of how we, like what was into each indicator rather, but you need to know that this rubric was developed keeping these steps in mind, right? So I'm just going to pause for a minute and let all of you just quickly read the rubric and think about how it connects back to what we just discussed, and then we'll move on.
So I think a lot of you are facing issues with the screen. And several of you helped with understanding how to make that better. So if you can go to your settings and make the quality and advance it by 720 pixels, I think that will help you to make the screen a little more clearer, right? And yeah.
Um, so yeah, so even though we have put this here, you need to know that, like we mentioned, we may try out all likely scenarios, but our rubric may still, when we are actually using it, we're putting it to practice. It when we are correcting, we realize that some things are missing, or there are some gaps. Go back and relook at your rubric, right? This is an iterative process. Even this rubric right here on the screen, need not be the final version. This is just one example and it's just the first version. When I actually use this to correct, to evaluate my subjective assessments or responses students have given, I may notice so many things that are missing, right? And then it's an iterative process that I need to keep coming back to and keep reworking, uh, keeping all the other factors in mind. So this was a section that we wanted to do, but I think this is something now you can do post facto, just keeping time in mind. We have 2 minutes to go, so we'll just quickly try to wrap up. So this is an exercise for all of you to try out. So go back to the rubrics that you have worked on for your own subjective assessments and try to write the indicators for each level. Okay? Okay, so now we've reached to the end of the steps to creating an effective rubric. Step one, list the criteria of the rubric, prioritize what the 3 to 5 main criteria are, fix the rating scale, decide what's the rating scale you want based on the variance in levels of your students, and develop the indicators for the criteria. First, fix it for the highest rating and then go backwards, right? So that's about the 3 steps to create an effective rubric. Now, coming to the last part in this section, right, which is in spite of me knowing these steps, knowing all of this, some key principles that we need to keep in mind when we are creating rubrics are number one, these are questions you need to ask yourself. Is the rubric aligned with the assessment and the learning objectives? Only then is it a valid rubric. Otherwise, it's not a valid rubric to be used. Second, reliability, right? Is the rubric defined clearly at each level to ensure unbiased scoring? This is when the objectivity comes into play. Specificity. Do the indicators, which is the descriptors, give a specific view of what is expected to allow more accurate and consistent scoring? This comes back to the point on language, right? If the language is not clear, not specific, it's going to lead to a lot of inconsistency because I may interpret it in a different way, you may interpret it in a different way, and leads to subjectivity. Third point, third point, which kind of like counteracts reliability, but is equally important, is that the rubric is broad based, which means it covers those likely scenarios that we spoke about. Even though we feel it's comprehensive enough, it's important that our rubric is not fully prescribed, but also has scope for covering aspects beyond what is like prescribed, which also typically qualifies. For example, like a student may write a piece and they may, instead, apart from my main idea, they may have made few more inferences, or instead of writing the main idea with supporting ideas, they may have mentioned that in a different way. They would have written the main idea, but it still typically qualifies as a correct answer. Then our rubric should be able to accommodate that as well, right? So it should be broad based enough and not very restrictive in nature. So these are some key principles to keep in mind to just quickly summarize and close this section. And on that note, we are done with the crux of what the workshop was, which was to create rubrics. And please go back and look at your own rubrics and keep these steps in mind while trying to create rubrics of your own. Over to you, Upasna.
Thanks, Shruti, and I will not take a lot of time.
Upasana, you're on mute. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. I was on mute. Apologies for that. No, so I'm just going to quickly summarize. What I was saying is that we're going to share a checklist with you with all the steps and the parameters that you will need to check when you are creating your own rubrics. And like Shruti has mentioned multiple times, that the rubric creation process is a very iterative process, meaning once you create the rubric, you will need to go back and check during the actual evaluation, is it actually helping you, not helping you, is it helping you assess all the students, not assessing the students, so on and so forth, right? We have already shared the link to the checklist on the chat. Also, my colleague has shared the feedback survey link. There's no code that's required. What I'm going to do in the meanwhile is also share with you how you can access all of this on our website. It's a portal that's very compatible to cell phones as well. On your cell phones you can, or on your device you can go to m.centa.org, and the page that is visible right now will come up, and then you need to click on the tile which says sign in to read more, and that's where you will have the resource that's associated with this webinar, right? So there are several more resources that the learning team has put together, and you should definitely go to the website, like I said, m.center.org, and click on sign in to read more. You can also download the checklist from there and get more resources that are that are relevant for this particular website webinar, right? Huge gratitude to each one of you to actually bear with us, and also given so many wonderful comments. I think the session was a lot more effective because of the kind of feedback and the inputs that kept coming in. And so yeah, so please, so Deepa ma'am will definitely looking at working on the online teaching program. So we'll definitely look at how we can get that back on. Like I said, please make sure that you're filling the feedback form. A lot of you've already been filling it. There's no code that is required. And the checklist is there on m.center.org. Mukta ma'am, there's a small typo in the, thank you for sharing it, but there's a small typo. It says m.center.org. So we'll be here for another couple of minutes if you have any questions. But again, thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.